Hello everyone, this is Sam of Historiansplaining. A historian tells you why everything you know is wrong. These lectures are on SoundCloud, YouTube, Stitcher, Spotify, and other platforms, and if you can help to keep them coming, please go to my Patreon page. The link should be in the description. So, as some of you surely know, I've spoken before about the history of the British monarchy, British politics, from medieval times up to recent times. I'm very interested in the role and the symbolism of monarchy in the modern world. And you may also know we are in a transitional period right now after the recent passing of Queen Elizabeth II, the longest reigning monarch ever in British history and one of the longest in all of known recorded history in the world. And the new king, Charles III, has taken the throne, but he has still not yet had his coronation. So, in a sense, the monarchy and all of its ceremonial and diplomatic functions is still in a kind of transitional, liminal state. We are still expecting, still anticipating this coronation that should close the door on the transition and formally open the reign of this new monarch. So I figured it would be a very good time to talk to my friend and fellow historian, Tobias Harper, who is a professor of history at Arizona State University, and who is the author of a recent book published by Oxford University Press titled From Servants of the Empire to Everyday Heroes, the British Honours System in the 20th Century. So this is about the honours system in the sense of the various organs and processes by which the British government gives out titles and distinctions like knighthoods and MBEs and OBEs and so on and so forth to British subjects and, in some times and places, to citizens of the Commonwealth realms outside Britain. And this shows a crucial way that the monarchy actually operates in modern society, and it's a point of contact between the monarchy and the wider British society and the wider Commonwealth. So it shows you some of the nitty-gritty of how that influence and that power really work, beyond just, of course, the celebrity and the spectacle of it all. I really, really loved Toby's book. It's beautiful. It makes really trenchant, powerful points. And as you'll see some in this interview, I'm going to play the interview that I just had a few days ago with Toby. There are many powerful, interesting, ironic, surprising, moving stories all woven all through this book. And we'll get to some of them, but there's no way we can possibly talk about all of them, so maybe at some point later on Twitter or another platform, I'll post some more of these remarkable stories and observations from this book. But without further ado, this is my recently recorded conversation with Tobias Harper, author of From Servants of the Empire to Everyday Heroes, the British Honours System in the 20th Century. So I loved this book. This was so much fun. It was like, it pushes all my buttons, like everything I find fascinating about status and class and modern society. I have so many things I'd love to bring up and talk about from this book.
I thought that the article that you wrote using little bits from the book was great, and like one of the most careful and interesting, well, probably the most careful and interesting reading I'd seen of what I had to say. So I really, really appreciated that article.
Well, I'm really glad you liked it. Yeah, it's called Into the Fairy Castle, right? And about sort of the evolution of liberalism and class. And I actually thought of your book because I remembered reading a chapter of it for a seminar at Columbia, and how you had these wonderful stories about all these people from different walks of life going to the palace, receiving their honors, and feeling so proud, so chuffed to meet the queen and be part of this beautiful ceremony, and how it seems almost no matter what someone's attitude was about monarchy or class or honors, once they got one, they were thrilled, right? It was like a highlight of their lives, almost no matter where they were coming from.
And those really were the most fun stories in the book to both research and to write up. I think that's really the core of the book to me.
it forms an interesting emotional note, right?
Yeah,
Because so much of it is technical. It's about the different
yeah,
titles and the different government offices trying to manage the system. And then in this last section, you get these personal encounters, these first person voices. And I also remember that one of them you had integrated in there was Jimmy Savile. And
yeah.
and
That's
you
sort
were
of a
saying at the
nasty
moment,
kind of surprise.
yeah, a bit of a creepy element that showed up. And we were discussing this just after all that terrible
Right.
information
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
his crimes. So for
Yeah.
people who don't know, do you want to explain briefly who Jimmy
Well,
Savile is?
I found that story before he died, and after his death. He was a British DJ, a major TV personality. He did a TV show called Jim will Fix It. I think that's right. About where he'd go around and do community work. He did a lot of community work for which he received eventually both an OBE and eventually a knighthood. And it turned out that he'd been, he was kind of a mass kind of serial abuser of young children, and that he'd used his position as this famous community worker and the kind of status that came from his honors to shield himself from criticism, both directly from his victims and from the many people around him who knew he was doing this. And it was a very, like, this came out after I'd already kind of written some sections of this chapter, and it was a very creepy experience. Creepy is exactly the right word.
Yeah, and it shows how the honors, it seems, there's this insight I think you have that the honors kind of cast almost like a magical spell. And I want to go back to that later too, that there's this kind of magic aura that comes from the crown, the palace, and also by extension the honors, which can then in a way sort of distort or blind people's vision, right? And that Jimmy Savile is one of these people who maybe benefited from that it kind of cloaked him with this aura of respectability. Right?
Yeah, definitely.
Conduct.
Definitely, I think that it shows the power of honors, and pinning down exactly what that does is really important, precisely because it has this kind of magical, re-enchanted quality coming out of what is, in certain ways, a very disenchanted system. It is a very bureaucratic, a very kind of organized system for producing this list of people who receive honors.
Yeah, and very secretive, right? And you make that point through most of the book, right? It's been very secretive until recent times. It's opened up somewhat, right? But before we get into all of that, let's back up.
Sorry.
What do you mean by? No, I just love jumping into it, but I should stop and say, what do we mean here by the honors system, right? And I'm trying to pronounce it with that British U, right? Which gives it this little respectable ring to it, right? The honors system. What we don't mean here like an academic honors system. We mean these sort of names, titles. You already mentioned Jimmy Savile, he got an OBE, and then later he got a knighthood, which is a higher honor. So basically, what is the honors system?
So towards the end of when I was writing this book, a engineer colleague at my old job pointed out to a seminar and we're talking about systems in general. It's an interdisciplinary seminar, and his favorite definition of systems was a system is a collection of systems. And I think that applies really well to the honor system. It's not one unified thing. It is a collection of different state honors, military and civilian, hereditary, non-hereditary, accumulated over hundreds of years, which in the 20th century are both kind of expanding in scope, but also increasingly centralized around a couple of government departments who really manage them. So it includes, on the one hand, I didn't really talk about this in the book, it includes military medals and some civilian gallantry medals. But the thing I was really interested in was the kind of subsystem of the system, which is the civilian state honors, especially but not exclusively around orders of chivalry and the knighthood. So these are rewards or honors that people are receiving for some kind of service to the state. The service ranges very widely across time and across these different honors. And I was really interested in the book and looking at what these honors meant and how the system changed over time, both from the end of the how it was run, but also who received it, how people thought about it.
Yeah, and you discuss a lot in the book why it changed and the sort of functions that it serves in British society, which to me seems very important, right? Because it's something that you encounter kind of in the background. If you look at British life, British society, you notice, oh, Judi Dench is Dame Judi Dench, and and Helen Mirren is MBE or whatever, and it just sort of pops up these letters and fixtures on people's names, but there's rarely, I think, any discussion about, well, how does this all work, and why does this system keep going and keep perpetuating itself, even when it seems a lot like the monarchy? It seems like, well, this must be so outmoded. How could people keep buying into this? And yet they do, right? People receive all these honors and very few turn them down. It's remarkable how rare it is for anyone to say, no, I don't need to be a commander of the Order of the British Empire, or whatever this, pompous sort of title is. It keeps going, and people seem to still like it. But to back up to two important things you mentioned, one is that this system expanded a lot in the 20th century, right? Which can seem ironic, right? Right at the time when the empire is breaking up, the Church of England, these other institutions are losing a lot of their power. This honor system expanded. So can you tell us first, how and why did that massive expansion begin?
Yeah. So I think there are a couple of processes going on. One, and it was expanding before I start my story. And if I could go back and change one thing about this book, I would have started earlier. I think I followed the nature of the records when actually I should have gone with my initial instinct, which was to start in the middle of the 19th century. But so there's sort of an expansion. I think one way to think about this is that the honor system expands with the state. The bigger the state gets, the more kind of institutional momentum there is to create more honors, to recognize the increasing number of state employees. That's what kind of one simple answer for why it expands in the 20th century is that you've got in the 19th century, you've got a kind of expanding imperial state with the new demands on kind of honors as a way of enforcing service and loyalty that comes from that. And in the 20th century, you've got more of an expanding the kind of welfare state, but also kind of the government in general is getting kind of bigger, is kind of reaching into more different parts of British society and economics. And logic of the honor system is that it kind of goes where the state goes. So I think that's part of it. The other part is that is more at the level of society, that this is also a expanding empire with a vastly more diverse and more populous range of people who are part of the empire. And by the in the kind of late 19th, early 20th century, it's a democratizing system where you've got more people are making a claim to be citizens who are worthy of recognition. So you've got both the kind of factors from within the expanding and evolving state, but you've also got a society that is, well, you've got not one society, but many different societies who are more confident and more insistent about making demands to be recognized by the system. In a way, the more and then it kind of snowballs, and the more popular it gets, the more people want to have a share of it.
Right. It's sort of an unstoppable cycle, right, of taking in more people, more constituencies. And you point out early on in the book, you sort of, as you said, you mentioned that there was this expansion in the Victorian age, but then the biggest jump, it seems, was the creation of this sort of imaginary group, right, that only exists like on paper, this Order of the British Empire, which was created in 1917, right at the height of the First World War. And thousands of people now are being given these medals and ribbons and this right to put letters after their name like MBE or OBE. So where did this Order of the British Empire come from, and why did it come up right in the middle of the First World War?
So the Order of the British Empire really The book is called The 20th Century, but the Order of British Empire, this creation of the Order of British Empire kind of is the driver of the opening chapter. And yeah, this is coming out of the large scale civilian mobilization in Britain in World War I, which is largely voluntary. And this is what feeds directly into the full male suffrage at the end of the war, partial women's suffrage at the end of the war. So this is kind of a democratizing moment in Britain. It's kind of the second to last stage of the very slow process of getting to full adult suffrage. And the Order of the British Empire it comes out of discussions in the government around, and I think David Lloyd George was already liked the idea of using honours to serve various political purposes. And so creating a new order of chivalry that would recognise the large-scale civilian voluntary effort was really important to him and to some other civil servants, to some royal servants, to the royal family, and to other politicians. But the key thing about the Order of the British Empire that made it a nice starting point is that this is the first order, actually it's the second, but the first large-scale order to recognise women alongside men equally to men, or basically equally to men. And it's also the first order to really serve the middle class on a large scale. But before this, almost all of the orders of chivalry were primarily for a pretty narrow band of the social elite. The Order of the British Empire is the first time that this is kind of opens up to this much wider range of the middle class.
Yeah. And once this order exists, you now have every year, these huge lists of thousands of people.
Yeah, especially early on. Yeah,
right.
It's kind of
right in the
spike
aftermath of the First World War. Yeah, so it's easy to forget the First World War was really a total war, right? There was this complete social mobilization, and the state, or at least certain people like the Prime Minister David Lloyd George, you mentioned, they had to look for ways to reward and reinforce that social mobilization that wasn't just giving out tons of money, right? It was like, you can see it in a way as kind of a substitute, right? If there's a huge voluntary mobilization, it's more inexpensive to give this sort of ceremonial recognition.
Exactly.
Rather than paying people billions and billions of pounds, right?
Yeah, and the government is already spending far more than it ever really wants to. So it had a great deal of appeal to people in government because Lloyd George gets caught up in various corruption scandals around honours and around other things. And one of the things he says around this time, I think I quote this in the book, is that selling honours, so actually having wealthy people who want status buying knighthoods or peerages, is more desirable than the American system where they just buy direct access. So they're spending their money on status, not on political influence. Yeah, in certain ways it's disingenuous because this is a system in which status gives you political influence. But I think this example shows the way in which the architects of the system were conscious of exactly this transaction that you're talking about. That this isn't entirely separated from the economy. That this is a way of getting something for free.
Right. It's a different kind of currency almost. And you in the beginning of the book, you refer to incidents that have happened, like David Beckham, his private communications, a terrible violation of his privacy. His communications were published, and it was found that he was spending a lot of money on charity with the hope of getting a knighthood. That was what he wanted, which to recapitulate is a very high level honor, right? Sort of most people who get an MBE or an OBE are not elevated to that level. Only a smaller set hopes of.
There's a triangle.
It's a pyramidal. It's very pyramidal.
Yeah.
And at the very top, just to be clear, you have these old chivalric orders like the Order of the Garter and the Order of the Bath, or at the highest level of prestige. But David Beckham, a football player from an ordinary background, he's hoping to get up into those upper tiers, and he's spending money philanthropically in that hope. And then it's not working, right? And you use this language, you say he didn't know what the exchange rates were, right? He didn't.
Yeah.
And so you use this metaphor that it's almost like exchanging one currency for another, right?
Yeah.
Money or labor can be
Yeah.
translated into these honors, and many people really want these honors a lot and will spend a lot of money and time trying to get them. But something that, to me, on the one hand, I said, oh, well, this is a useful metaphor, right? It's a clever conceit. But at the same time, the main government office that managed and set the quotas of these honors was the Treasury up until recent
Yes.
times. And I
Yeah.
just kept asking, why the Treasury? Isn't that kind of crazy?
Yeah. And I think this is a reflection of the status of the Treasury. The Treasury was kind of the leading government office in the time period we're looking at. I think that the ceremonial office ends up as part of a Treasury because the Treasury is the head of the civil service. But I think this means that Treasury officials bring Treasury logic to honours. It kind of ends up being this very suitable place precisely because of what you just suggested. This is kind of more than a metaphor for them for a cash economy.
Well, you use it a number of times, this language that the Treasury had to fight inflation, right? Which is so funny
hate
because
inflation.
that's exactly the sort of thing we're talking about today, right? Is how do we tweak our exchange rates, our interest rates to control inflation? And it's remarkable how easily that vocabulary seems to transfer into this world of dispensing honors. Did you find Treasury officials speaking that way themselves and drawing?
Oh yeah. I came up with this because this is exactly how they were thinking about it. That they were very concerned about deflation. I think that was particularly fascinating because honors are free in a sense. They cost money to mint the medals and to do the administration, but as we were discussing before, it's a fairly cheap way of recognizing people. But the Treasury, especially in the 1920s, 1930s, was very concerned about keeping the numbers at a minimum, even though, in a way, there was no, unlike with real money, there was no need to do that. You could just honor 10,000 people as opposed to 1,000 in the next honors list. The cost would be nebulous. It would be about reputation. It would be the newspaper editorials that say, "Are we giving out too many MBEs?" But I think in terms of recipients, there's always just make it clear, there's always way more demand for this. There are always many more people making nominations, nominating their colleagues, their peers, people in their community, than there are honors to go out. Mm-hmm. That doesn't have to be the case, but there is still this desire to keep the honors to a certain number that's set, more or less arbitrarily.
So they always maintain that scarcity, right? It's always less than the demand. And it's interesting, the part of the irony is using this language of currency as if this was all so quantifiable, when really the social value and the prestige of these honors and awards is very abstract, right? It's really, it's soft power. And it seems to, keeping this demand going seems to serve a sort of soft power function of the state, right? And there are sort of two things I want to get into about that. One is the fact that there is this deep imperial background, right?
Yes.
And it struck me in reading your book how often India and the British Raj in India seem to be kind of formative in conceiving of this system and defining it. And that, in fact, we talk about the order of the British Empire, but there was an order of the Indian Empire that predated that.
Yes.
And can you tell us how did these honors and titles work in India, and was that maybe a forerunner or a template?
I think the Indian honors are really interesting. They're a template almost by accident. That there are two things. I guess one is kind of analytical, that Indian historians of India have written about the honor system in very, very different terms to how historians of Britain write about it. in as much as historians of Britain write about it at all. Historians of India write about honours as a kind of fairly blatant attempt by the imperial state to buy the loyalty of Indian elites. And I think this is very helpful because it kind of gets at the transactional nature and it's sort of getting at exactly what these transactions mean. And that's easy to see in the records because it's pretty clear in the India Office records that this is how British officials see it as well. It's really interesting because the British officials themselves are receiving the same honours as the Indians that they're also honouring. They value them in the same way that for themselves, in the same way that people back in Britain value honours, or in the same ways, I should say. There's not one template necessarily. But they're very cynical about Indian honours. They see Indian honours as a way of disciplining and controlling Indian elites. This is a couple of
carrot and stick. Sorry to It's like the carrot aspect of this campaign to manage Indian society, right?
Yeah, and it's kind of tied up in an older Orientalist idea that the British have that India is a place you need to manage through kind of like quasi-feudal mechanisms that British Indian officials believe, and by the 20th century that they're more or less wrong about this in most cases, that honours are an essential tool for managing Indians and kind of are something that Indians are unusually susceptible to, the charm of. The irony being that they themselves are really value these honours. There's a debate in 1947, 1948 between British officials and Jawaharlal Nehru about whether or not they can keep honours lists going for 1 or 2 more years after Indian independence. And Nehru's like, no. Indian nationalists do not like the system. He and Jinnah can agree on this, and so they cut it off. But clearly, some of these British officials they're saying, well, no, we owe the army a certain number of honours. We need to keep it going because we have this kind of ongoing debt, and we need a couple more years to pay it off. But also, obviously, they are concerned about this because once the Order of the Indian Empire ends, they're not going to get their honours when they get back to the UK. There's sort of the dual nature of it. So, to come back to the question, the Indian honour system is rewarding both British civil servants who are managing the Indian Empire and Indian elites. And the British are fairly careful to try and keep the numbers about even. So they want to look like this is a equal system. Equal's the wrong word, but they want to look like there's sort of parity between honouring British people versus honouring Indians. The problem is Indians don't. And this is in the late 19th century. Indians don't really have any senior positions in the government of India. So there are some Indian civil servants, but the senior positions are all held by British administrators. So the British have to look elsewhere in Indian society. The more Indian honours they create, the more they have to look elsewhere in Indian society, Indian civil society, for people to honour. Which means that in the 19th century, you're getting the Indian honour system is the one where you can see a larger range of kind of philanthropists or scholars, business people in India getting honours in a way that anticipates how it changes in Britain in the 20th century. I'm not sure if Britain is getting it from India, but it's kind of a product of the way the system works in India.
Yeah, it seems like a remarkable parallel, and and as you said, it seems like a great case of projection, right? There's this sort of infantilizing notion that the Asian people want ceremony and pageantry, and they can be bought off with praise and awards and baubles, and yet all of that translates beautifully to Britain, right? It's British people who love this stuff and who are so impressed with it. And you have this wonderful short story that you quote by Rudyard Kipling.
By Kipling,
Classic British imperialist, orientalist, despite having a certain degree of understanding of Indian society, nonetheless, he's very, very orientalist. And he has this story where Indian people are upset and wailing because a fount of honor has been closed, right? And there's this repeating metaphor that these honors are are like coming out of a spring or a fountain, and the
which is the
source,
person of the monarch. The monarch is the founder.
right, the ultimate source is the king or queen himself. And so they're upset, they're wailing, but then the fountain starts up again and they're relieved, and we're getting a KSCT or whatever these acronyms are for these honors. Yeah. And then a young British boy in India hears this commotion and says, well, oh, I understand, because I was very happy when I was given the award for best singer today. And in some ways, I think it encapsulates this duality, right? You can see them as equal or similar, but at the same time, it's likening Indian adults to a British child. Right?
Yeah. Well, and I think this highlights the inequalities of empire, because you've got a system that's trying to be equal, but it can't, because it's a system that's all about status and hierarchies. And if your hierarchies aren't equal, then you can't produce this equalized outcome in terms of honors.
Yeah, and a lot of this paradox, and maybe we'll go back to this at the end, hopefully, if we have a minute, but this paradox then also transfers to Britain. When people say things, they're, the order of the British Empire is created during the First World War, and for the first few years into the 1920s, it's given out to just totally unprecedented numbers of people, right? People who may have worked as nurses or ambulance drivers or factory managers. Thousands of people are getting these honors. And some people say, well, this is good. And I think one writer said, this is British democracy's own order of chivalry, which struck me as this perfect paradox, right? But how can an order of chivalry be democratic? Aren't those two things contradictory? I mean, do you think that they succeeded somehow in squaring that circle?
The term I've used, and I think I use this in the book, is it's a democratization of hierarchy. That it's like the hierarchies that previously people were familiar with only by kind of looking up at the kind of village dignitaries or the people at the top of their society, now reaches into the middle class and eventually the working class. So there's kind of this expansion of hierarchy, or expansion of kind of a classificatory hierarchy into more and more of society. But in doing this, this also creates a democratization of hierarchy in a different sense, that more people start talking about it, more people care about it, more people get involved in debates about who is receiving what and why. So I think that there is something about this, and I do have trouble kind of articulating, putting my finger on what is distinctive about this in relation to British society, both in comparison to the empire and in comparison to other societies which have honor systems, which is in most, the United States has an honor system, but no one really cares that much about it in the way they do about the British system. And I think this is part of that this is something that people care about the closer they are to it. And caring about it it goes back to the magical aspect of it. So it isn't consistent with their political principles. It isn't necessarily the same between neighbours or between different communities, or all the many, many different communities within Britain, the British Empire. But it does kind of take over more of society. Take over is the wrong word. It becomes more important to more people the more it expands. And like the very glib way of saying this is that the more you rank people, the more people care about rank.
And I think you make the case very well that it's penetrated into sort of all sectors of British society that you can find. And the immigrant communities, celebrities, pop culture, all of them get woven in some way or another. There's sort of no corner of British society that I think you can find that's totally untouched. And you even have, maybe I'll refer to this again later, this story of a man who was homeless, who suffered from homeless. He ends up getting an honor, and some people see that as almost like honoring the homeless community. Like there's even the very lowest rungs, the down and out, are still somehow affected by this system. And I think in the book, there's a sort of funny dual perspective where you try to capture what people value and
Yeah.
how this works in their lives, while at the same time looking at it critically and seeing how this is a function
Yeah.
of state power and a way of kind of managing society. You sort of see it through both perspectives that way. And I wondered, I want to bring this up too, is that you yourself are from New Zealand, right? If I
Yeah.
remember right. Yeah. You
Yeah.
grew up in New Zealand, which is a Commonwealth realm, right? So it was part of
Yes.
this Victorian British Empire. It's now effectively an independent nation, but it still has this special tie to Britain and the British crown. And the head
Yeah.
of state is still technically the king, right? As we would say today. And do you first?
I would have slipped and said the Queen.
I know we still have to
I'm still,
adjust,
I
right?
still haven't adapted. I haven't adapted yet.
Well, yeah, after 70 years of saying the Queen, it takes a little time to adjust there. And and that's a whole other question. Will people
Yeah.
still feel the same connection to this whole system now that it's a king and not the Queen? But for one thing, in your background in New Zealand, did you find that people were very conscious of the monarchy, the royal family, honors,
Yeah.
titles? Was this part of people's experience and thinking in New Zealand?
I think less so than in the UK. I think it is different from the UK. I use quite a lot of New Zealand examples in the book because New Zealand's an interesting case and because I enjoyed doing research there. I haven't lived in New Zealand for 15 years now. I moved away a while ago. I think this gets back to what you were saying earlier about I think it's a helpful metaphor to think about the honour system as sort of the background noise of a lot of what's going on in modern Britain. I think it's true of New Zealand in a slightly different way. Growing up in New Zealand, I was conscious of honours as especially knighthoods as something, and damehoods as something that exists and something that means something, but it's a very vague sense. So I didn't care about the fine details of the ranks and the New Zealand Order of Merit, which is kind of the New Zealand replacement to the Order of the British Empire in the 1990s. Well, so it starts a bit earlier in the 70s, but fully replaces the Order of the British Empire in the 90s. And I think the background noise, that kind of honours as background noise of other things in New Zealand society is a more faded and more distant background noise than is in Britain, if that abuse that metaphor. But I think the more powerful influence growing up was that I was reading British books, I was watching British TV, so you kind of have this dual thing where you've got both what it is in 1980s and 90s New Zealand, but also then you're getting this longer, deeper, both in time and in I think in society and kind of social terms, thing from British culture.
It seems to speak to this issue and this other kind of ongoing tension and debate that runs through the book about what makes the British honors so appealing. And but as we said, the most widespread honor that people now get is Order of the British Empire. And there are different ranks, right? You can MBE and then OBE and then CBE, and people of higher status and wealth might get a higher rank than others. But most of the people who receive an honor and go to the palace, this is what they're being invited into, is the Order of the British Empire. And just saying the words Order of the British Empire, can strike so many people as this is outdated, anachronistic, even offensive, right? When we think about the atrocities that the British regime committed in many countries. And yet it hasn't been changed. And there's this sort of counter argument that no, the anachronism of it is what makes it appealing. So and Prince Philip comes into this story. So just as an interesting way to start, how did Prince Philip weigh in on this question about the name of this order?
So early on in his career as the consort of the Queen, he was made the Grand Master of the Order of the British Empire, so the symbolic head of the Order of the British Empire. And like a number of things, he was a kind of reformer, and he wanted to be active in this role. And one of the suggestions he made through the 50s and 60s, just exactly at a time when decolonization is sort of ramping up and it's becoming clear that the empire is not going to last that much longer, he is lobbying behind the scenes to rename the Order of the British Empire to something else it's not, that doesn't have empire in the name for all the reasons that you described. So in a way, he's pretty ahead of his time, or he's pretty on to the fact that this name is potentially pretty offensive to a lot of people. He wants to update it. And he doesn't get anywhere with this. Even though he's the Grand Master of the Order of the British Empire, the people who actually run it in the Treasury have no interest in changing the name. There are people in the Commonwealth Office who do want to change it, who are supporting Philip, but ultimately the Treasury puts an end to all of this discussion. And their argument, they have two arguments, one of which was proven false within a couple of years of their making it, which was that people in the Commonwealth don't care and actually quite like the name. They specifically cite the Caribbean as a place where this is the case, and they're only listening to white Jamaicans who are basically British officials. They're not paying attention to the actual wider feeling of the majority of the population of Jamaica or Trinidad. So they're clearly wrong about this. Their other argument, though, is that there's something, the more obsolete the British Empire becomes, the better the name is, that obsolete names are a good thing, that because they're enchanting, because they capture a nostalgic sense of the past. So there is kind of this moment where this debate seems really important, that if you're calling this the Order of the British Empire, then surely those places which were once part of the British Empire, which are now breaking away and in certain ways opposing empire, if you're using it in those places, then you need to rename it. But once those places start naming their own honours, start kind of dropping the Order of the British Empire and renaming, or sort of creating new honours which with new national names, then there's less pressure on the Order of the British Empire to rename. And this kind of argument about the antiquity of the name, even though it's only a few decades old, this argument about the name being obsolete, being a good thing, starts to really take off. So that, especially internally, I think this is something that's really important for ceremonial office in the 20th century. There's also a political debate that parallels this. This comes up in politics here and there, but it's almost always shut down immediately by the Prime Minister in response to this internal lobbying from the Treasury. So, and this is a really interesting case because it shows where the monarchy tries to get involved behind the scenes and completely fails, even though in this case, at least, this intervention is actually a pretty clever one. I think it would have been better if Prince Philip had succeeded here for the honour system as a whole. Whether that's better from my perspective is different, but it would have been healthy for the honour system to think about that change earlier. I know for a fact that this is an ongoing discussion internally. I think the modern ceremonial office has a very different attitude to this question than the one in the Treasury in the 50s. But yeah, this is a really strange debate because you're getting this idea that obsolescence is valuable. And I think this anticipates a lot of kind of where the British heritage industry goes at the end of the 20th century.
I think this is all so fascinating. Every aspect of it has so many implications to it, and I think you point out astutely that Philip is thinking about the monarchy and the royal family.
Yeah.
He is conscious. Yeah. He wants to dissociate the monarchy from the empire. He doesn't like those associations.
Yeah. And I think he's looking forward to a monarchy, a kind of Commonwealth monarchy. He wants to keep those connections with the former empire and keep them healthy. Whereas the actual direction the honour system takes is a more narrowly British system.
It's very interesting when you look at the chronology, right? Just as you said, very soon in the 1970s, nations like Jamaica, Trinidad, they chose to opt out of this British honor system, right? They remain in the Commonwealth. So for some of those countries, the British monarch is still their head of state. They still have this special association. Jamaica is, right, yeah. And a few other smaller nations in the Caribbean. But they have refused to continue with this OBE and all of these orders. But then there are sort of intermediate cases like Australia and New Zealand where it continued a bit longer, but then they phased it out and replaced it with their own system. And the one place where it keeps going is within Britain, right? So it seems like the British themselves find this idea of the order of the British Empire most appealing, most amenable. And it can seem on the one hand like, oh, well, it more or less falls along lines of race, right? That if you're of British descent, this all sounds great to you. You like the nostalgia. And these Treasury officials, remarkably, you quote them, they even use the word nostalgia. People like this nostalgia for the empire. Whereas if you are from an Asian or African heritage, you reject it, right? But then you also point out that within Britain, it's not that simple. There are even people from other nations who have immigrated to Great Britain, and they've almost exactly repeated what the Treasury officials said, that, oh, it's outmoded, it's anachronistic, but that makes it harmless. That makes it sort of charming, not offensive.
And this is a big debate now. And I think from the 90s, you get this kind of rebounds that more and more there's both political and kind of, I think, internal civil service, a kind of desire to use the honour system to paint a different picture of Britain's contemporary diversity. And they run again and again to this problem that there'll always be a small but significant number of potential recipients of these honours who say, look, my ancestors were enslaved by the British Empire. I'm not going to accept I'm not going to become a commander of the British Empire because it's just, this is still a minority, but every time it happens, it's a challenge to this kind of nostalgic order that I think it's a really interesting debate because you get so many different perspectives on this. I mentioned the kind of Nigerian British artist Yinka Shonibare in the very end of the book, who kind of accepts an MBE, but then he kind of uses it as to kind of ironically brand his art, which is very much about taking images from kind of classical art and giving them this kind of post-colonial twist. I'm not really describing that very well. So his acceptance and use of the MBE is itself a kind of ironic commentary in the same way that his art is. And so you've got this really wide range of debates and responses to this in contemporary Britain, which I think is really, really interesting.
Yeah, and I want to ask you about a remarkable instance of this, right? As we said, there are very few refuseniks, right?
Yeah.
And even those who do refuse, if you look in the records, there are some people like C.S. Lewis and David Bowie who have said no, but we don't really know why. I mean, as far as I know, I don't have an explanation of why they declined these honors. But then there's this instance of Benjamin Zephaniah, who is a poet who was born in Great Britain. He's from Birmingham, but he's Rastafari. So I assume he has a West Indian heritage.
Yeah.
And you quote in 2001, he wrote a very scathing poem about how people of West Indian heritage are sort of used as props in Britain.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And he wrote, quote, "The ancestors would turn in graves. Those poor black folk that once were slaves would wonder how our souls were sold and check our strategies. The empire strikes back and waves. Tamed warriors bow on parades. When they have done what they've been told, they get their OBEs." So he's referring to this honor of being an officer of the Order of the British Empire, kind of little second tier honor. And then you explain 2 years later, in 2003, the British government offered him an OBE. Exactly.
After he wrote this poem, which was kind of...
2 years after this poem that specifically mocks how people are sort of bought off or turned into props, it seems he's saying, with these honors. And he said no. And this raises a number of questions in my mind. One of them is, it's such a perfect irony. Do you think that this is sort of an intentional strategy, that the government will find critics who stand outside the sort of traditional system of status and national symbolism and specifically try to draw them in? Like, is this not just an accident?
I don't think so. I think it would have been, I think this is actually a failure of their cross-checking system. If they had been paying attention to this poem, they probably wouldn't have made the offer. I think this is more a kind of product of that kind of bureaucratic logic of the system, that they're looking for prominent community figures, prominent Black community figures and artists. And Zephaniah is a good. I mean, if anything, maybe Zephaniah is more prominent than a OBE really
merit
rank. And I think his time, as he probably knew when he wrote that poem, his time was going to come up sooner or later, because he is the kind of person that the government at the time especially was looking for. So I think that he was a really useful example for me, because he says outright stuff that I think a lot of people thinking about these questions are debating internally. And it also reflects something. One of the criticisms that a couple of people directed at Zephaniah was, you're not supposed to talk about it. You're not supposed to say if you're offered an honor. It's all secret. It's an insult to the Queen. But they said that when it was a Black guy with dreadlocks who did it. They don't say it when it's scientists who. And if you look at the 1950s the Royal Society, there's much the same debate. Actually, 1940s. It's a very similar debate, or similar arguments come from a couple of scientists who end up rejecting knighthoods, saying that at a time when science is increasingly state-sponsored and kind of the state is kind of taking over more and more of scientific research during the war and after the war, that they see the kind of expansion of honors within their field as being a kind of sign of integration into the establishment. And those who are opposed to integration, like Zephaniah, who couches that critique very much in terms of, I don't want to be part of Tony Blair's establishment. It's those scientists in the 40s who are rejecting the knighthoods because they want to be independent. They see this as being a way of yoking them to the state and to politics in a way that isn't desirable. And Zephaniah's statement about this is very political. He criticizes Blair a lot, even though Blair's role in this was ticking his name off on a list. But in a way, I think the critics of Zephaniah were getting it fundamentally wrong, because the fact that Zephaniah was wanting to talk about this, again, shows that he cared and was thinking about what an honor meant. And I think that's, in a way, more interesting than someone who just wants it because of a fancy name, fancy letters after your name.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point that I think your perspective can bring out, is that if nobody's refusing these honors, then they must not mean anything, right? They must be just superfluous, right? There has to be some kind of weight and significance to it for people to weigh and debate, do I want this? Do I want this attached to me and my name, right?
I think through the 20th century, the government officials and royal officials had a lot of trouble with in a way, the results of the success of a system. But again, it goes back to this idea of democratization. Democratization is a two-way street. And actually, it goes back to something you were saying earlier, that people project themselves onto these honors. And when it's a very kind of specific and bounded symbolism, the hierarchy of these honors. They're supposed to mean one thing. They're not supposed to be something that you play with. But the fact that people are doing so much with them, Shonabare with his kind of using it as part of his artistic branding, or people rejecting them, or I think I have an illustration here of the milkman who wears a suit patterned like a Frisian cow to his investiture. I think that the ways in which people project their concerns and their community's concerns onto the honors that they receive or don't receive or reject shows how much they mean to the communities where they are relevant.
There are at least two significant forces sort of at work here that help to account for why the system remains compelling and people continue to care about it. And one is that an honor can have this dual function where it's sort of giving approval and distinction to a certain person. But at the same time, whenever you ask someone, why did you get this award? What does it represent? they seem to always say, oh, well, it's not about me individually. It's about the community I'm part of. This is really a recognition for nurses or general practitioners or engineers. It's not about me individually. And it has this sort of, it has this social meaning, right?
Yeah.
But of course, to me, that strikes me as another paradox. Like, well, then why not give the honor to the group, right? Why are you honoring the group through this one selected individual, right? And do you see that tension coming up? And like, how do they sort of square the circle of that?
It certainly comes up in cases where unpopular bosses or people who are notoriously thorny but prestigious get honored, and their colleagues or subordinates are a little bit resentful of this. So symbolism can go two ways. That if you're going to recognize a community through a symbolic head of that community, you better make sure that symbolic head isn't a complete jerk. But yeah, I think this is particularly important in a increasingly atomized and fragmented and anomic society. I think this is one of the really interesting things, kind of seen from a larger view, this power to make community bonds seem stronger, to kind of unite people around one figure in a way that makes the community seem important. But it's a very shallow, it's sort of papering over isn't quite the right metaphor, but it's a very fragile, it's a very fragile way of doing it in a society that is so fragmented and is under so much strain in so many ways. I think you can see this really clearly in Britain today, that at a time of economic and political crisis, there's both this potential to take a figure like, embarrassingly, I can't remember his name, the guy the very old guy who walked around his yard at the beginning of the pandemic to raise money. You have these figures where they can kind of powerfully express the concerns of society or the community, but that doesn't fix anything. This is a kind of feel-good moment, but if the problems that they're addressing are the creation of the very institutions that are giving these honors, at a certain point that just starts to fragment. One of the big shifts across the 20th century is a shift from recognizing state service to recognizing voluntary service, especially from the 80s and the 90s, especially 90s. The honor system shifts to focus more and more on voluntary service. And again, part of the problem there is that this coincides with the proliferation of charities and voluntary service, that more and more the British society is relying more and more on voluntary work and on charitable giving to kind of fix expanding social problems that are coming out of the kind of deconstruction of the welfare state. And giving those people honors doesn't solve the problem. In certain ways, that's been very popular because these people are generally getting honors for things that you, especially at a low level, that were voluntary, is a really appealing story. So it's a really appealing, it's kind of, that's the critique of a lot of the earlier honor systems. So it just goes to civil servants. And so I think that shift in who gets honors, which is largely achieved through an expansion of the honor system rather than through cutting other categories, was really popular and for good reason, but it doesn't fix the problem. It's only a brief moment of feeling good that comes from that. It isn't uniting these communities in the way that maybe is the intention.
And it doesn't move real resources, right? It moves this sort of soft social prestige, but not hard money.
And then you have cases like the Beckham case you mentioned earlier, when people respond to the system by responding to its incentives and actually giving a lot of money. That is also kind of not blameless. That also gets criticized. The really interesting thing about from 19th century India through to the present is that if people are discovered to be doing the things that the honor system incentivizes for the wrong reasons, they get made fun of or they get criticized. So it's a lose-lose situation, especially for someone like Beckham from a more modest social background, because on the one hand, he's doing what he should do. He's doing the things that you're supposed to do to get a knighthood, because that's the way the system is set up here. This is supposed to be an incentive for charitable work and for that converting wealth and celebrity into social service. But the fact that he wanted it was the problem. The fact that he was responding to these incentives was something the media then made a great deal of fun of.
Yeah, well, it's almost a classic catch-22, right?
Yeah.
That you shouldn't want this thing,
Yes.
but if you get it, you should be very happy and grateful that you get
Yeah.
it. But it's bad if you wanted it. Right now.
And I think you see that in people's responses to getting nominated and receiving awards, that one of the main emotions people express is surprise. No one really wants to be thought to have expected it or be thought to have taken it for granted, especially among the wider public outside of the areas where people traditionally received honors.
And as you quote and point out over and over again, this sort of logic that you shouldn't want it, you shouldn't expect it, it should be a surprise. It's almost as if to maintain its aura, it has to be a bit arbitrary.
Yeah, that's true.
And this logic keeps being then used against civil servants, right? That they shouldn't be getting all these honors, and they're automatic, right? This is the phrase they keep using. You shouldn't be automatically getting honors just because you were a minister or an undersecretary, etc. And there's this sort of campaign in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, this campaign to shift honors in the direction of the voluntary sector and away from civil servants, bureaucrats. And it did strike me that, I'm going to use this sort of loaded word, right? It struck me as in line with kind of neoliberalism, which is, a term that people complain about. It's very vague. It's very broad. But I mean, I would say it basically refers to this mindset that the state shouldn't tackle social problems directly through state action. It should operate through the market, the private sphere, and it should use sort of market incentives, right? So it seems to me, it seems remarkably in line. If you look at these honors as sort of a way of the state incentivizing or nudging, right? This famous term, a way to nudge people into the kind of action that people want, rather than using state power and resources directly. Do you see that as?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Interestingly, it's John Major who really, I think, identifies this. But Margaret Thatcher was not particularly interested in honours, except in a more traditional political sense of rewarding donors. And it's really John Major who takes the kind of logic of a kind of, well, I think, so there's a lot of emphasis in 80s and 90s, especially in the 90s, in conservative politics about like a classless society. It kind of the idea that the old class hierarchies need to be kind of broken down and reconstituted on the basis of merit as defined by success in the market. And I think what Major was trying to do with his reforms in the early 90s was break down, kind of get rid of the civil service automaticity. That was a big concern. And also break down the connection between hierarchy and honours. The problem was that the honour system is innately hierarchical. The way to do this would actually just be to take Tony Benn, kind of, this is not work, but to just create one honour and everyone gets the same honour and have no hierarchy at all. But because honours have hierarchies and because it remains a pyramid, who gets what does change after the 90s, but you kind of get a different view of what the new hierarchies in kind of neoliberal multicultural Britain are. So there are these real meaningful changes to who receives honours, but it's a mirror to how social hierarchy and economic hierarchies have changed in Britain at the end of the century.
It struck me, in India, there were these social critics who were very trenchant and who said, this whole system is a way of buying people off. It's a social manipulation. In Britain, there are different criticisms from all different directions, but they tend to be about who's getting the honors and who isn't.
Yes, yeah. Right? It's sort of a game. It's like the criticism, the same criticism is more implicit rather than explicit. And I think that actually, I come back to the sort of more personal point for what you were saying earlier about New Zealand versus Britain here, that doing this research and living in Britain for a while, doing the research, like growing up in New Zealand, I felt like I was kind of, if not British, then at least kind of sort of British. I was definitely an Anglophile. doing this research made me see myself as being very, very different. It made me understand the ways in which I am not British. And the culture that I kind of soaked up when I was a kid is not what Britain actually is. And, you know, I very much am not an Anglophile now. I would not identify that way. I think the more I did this research, the more I saw myself more like one of these external critics trying to understand the logic, more like an anthropologist, trying to understand, well, like an old school anthropologist, trying to understand a cultural system from outside of it, and less like someone who was like a distant cousin of the culture that I'm looking at. Yeah.
You could say, in a sense, you were disenchanted.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think that those terms of kind of reenchantment, disenchantment became more important to me the more I thought about this, because I realized to say something different and to kind of reflect my research, I had to be a bit more of a kind of social scientist talking about systems, more like those earlier Indian critics of trying to understand what exactly is this doing? What are the transactions here? What's the relationship between the kind of the culture and the underlying system?
Yeah, and it definitely struck me, it seemed like your book is sort of doing the kind of critique that these scholars in India did, maybe just in a more nuanced, kind of fine-grained way, but applying that sort of critique to the system within Britain, rather than just the empire and the colonies, but within Britain itself.
Yeah. And bringing the critique home.
Yeah. And just to sort of sum up like what we've been talking about, there's, I think, this kind of core passage near the middle of the book when you're just about to get to the part about the Beatles, which is so wonderful. But you basically sum up that in your argument, the system serves, quote, to foster a relationship between the state, the crown, and civil society, where the newly included deferred to existing social hierarchies, right?
Yeah.
So it can bring in new people, but they have to be integrated into these value systems that exist. And then you say the inclusion of new groups, so we can talk about women, volunteers, celebrities, all of these people, the inclusion of new groups was a way of investing them in an older system of social hierarchy, as well as a form of recognition of their importance in modern society. Yeah. So I was sort of wondering, for one thing, I mean, do you think it's been successful? Do you think it continues to be effective?
Oh, I think the system, getting back to kind of like theory of systems, like the monarchy, it's hard to define success. Like, is success about continuing? Because it's been successful itself at perpetuating itself. But in perpetuating itself, it changes. It adapts to new circumstances. And I'm not sure if there is a clear measure for success at this point. That I think the people running it in the 1920s would be horrified both to see what modern Britain is like, but also with what it has become. It all depends on what you see as being its criteria for success. So yeah, I'm not necessarily a big fan of it. I think it would be much better if it looked a different way, or if it didn't exist at all. But I think in the balance, it has been successful, but it owes a lot of its success to how people have responded to it as opposed to how it's been run. Maybe that's a good way of putting it.
Okay, so the success is more in how people have participated and interpreted it in their own ways, right?
That's what it needs. That's what it needs in order to work.
Yeah, and just I want to talk, if you still have a few minutes, I'll want to talk a little bit about the monarchy and this transition going on. But just lastly, before we go to that, I wanted to again bring up this story that struck me, where a man named Nick Charles, who was a recovering alcoholic, started an organization, and he had been homeless at one point in London. But he starts this organization to help alcoholics. He receives an honor. So he goes to the palace, right, along with dozens of other people who have been invited on this day to receive this medal and shake the monarch's hand. And
I think in this case, he shook then Prince Charles's hand, I think.
So the Prince, right, the Prince of Wales at that time. So sometimes it's another member of the household,
Yeah, yeah.
right? It might not be the queen or king themselves, but he has this experience. Then he commandeers a camera crew and says, I'm going to go show you where I used to sleep under a bridge. And he goes there to this site of a homeless encampment. He meets a man there named Bob, whom he knew. And he's, they're moved, they're crying. And he says, I'm going to come back. And Bob says, no, don't. I think this is a crucial moment. Bob says, don't come back. And he says, you won't come back because you got to keep going forward. You're all we've got. You got to do what none of us could do. You're all we've got left. And then he further explains he's still in this difficult position as an addict, right? But he says, one thing's changed. One of us has made it to the palace.
Right.
And, it's a moving story, but it also struck me that it seems to really exemplify a lot of what we've been talking about. You don't need actual action to solve social problems. You just need this symbolism of one of you being plucked up to this elevated position, right? So you say, do you see this as sort of similar maybe to what was done in the colonies, right? That this sort of gesture of picking out certain special individuals and elevating them can kind of obscure how actual wealth and power are really working in society.
Yeah. Especially when the honor system is itself, you've got figures there like Nick Charles who have put a lot of time into helping people. But look at the upper levels of the honor system, and it's more similar to what it was 100 years ago than the lower levels. But yeah, I think there's a lot of ambiguity in that story. And what does Bob mean by moving forward? What does he mean by one of us has gone to the palace? It's left a bit open-ended. And I spent a lot of time kind of puzzling over that story and and it took me a long time to figure out how to write that up. I think this might be a way of actually looking at the monarchy as well. Because I think that the honor system and the monarchy are tied to one another. And if you think about success, I think they're, even though, as I talk about quite a lot, most honors are decided upon by committees of civil servants. In people's minds, the honor system is overwhelmingly connected with the monarchy partly because people go to the palace to receive their honors. So that the most important ceremonial stage in honors is directly associated with a senior member of a royal family.
Yeah.
And I think one of the problems for both the royal family and the honors system, and this is relevant to contemporary debates about Charles, is that going back to the relative retreat of the welfare state in Britain, this makes the monarchy more important. Like the monarchy has had the central role in both kind of authenticating who the honored people in society are, but also in running the voluntary sector. These are probably the two most important roles of the monarchy in the second half of the 20th century, and they're very much linked. One of the reasons why this shift to focus on voluntary service for honors is very successful, I think, is because it brings these two functions of a monarchy together. It means that the closer association between the monarchy's leadership of voluntary sector on the one hand, and their kind of public role as the head of the honor system on the other. But the more the voluntary sector is central to questions of poverty, health, the environment, education in modern Britain, the more that kind of responsibility is shifting from government to the monarchy in a way. Like this shift has made the monarchy more political by default. And I think in this transition from Elizabeth to Charles, I think a bit of that's been lost, that people see their personalities and their kind of public images as being, Elizabeth was just really, really good at being neutral and Charles is kind of more meddling or whatever. But in fact, late Elizabeth's reign is really different from early Elizabeth's reign, that the role of monarchy has changed by default, largely invisibly, or sort of at least not invisibly, but without a whole lot of comment, to being more central to British society.
I really think that's an important point, that if they were just ceremonial figureheads, we wouldn't be talking about them all the time. They command a fascination, and I think that fascination is it reflects something real about how people are living and acting and working, that people want symbols, and they want symbols that aren't just automatons, right? They want symbols that seem like people with thoughts and
Right.
attachments. And somehow it seems like Elizabeth, she made some mistakes. She is certainly not above criticism, and the monarchy is not above criticism, at least in.
I certainly agree with that.
Yeah. But she struck an effective balance, right? That people felt that they could imagine her as a real flesh and blood person at the same time that she was totally above it all and above politics.
And crucially imagine her as being like them. I think Elizabeth was either really good or really bad at, probably really good at being a kind of blank slate onto which people could project their own concerns, sympathies, and interests. Even though she was this aristocratic horse racing enthusiast who bred corgi. She did all these things. The things we do know about her personal life are not surprising for someone from the British royal family, but she kept a lot of other things mysterious, which enabled people to see in her what they wanted to see, both positive and negative. Right? I think her critics, as much as her fans, did that. I don't think anyone's going to get close to knowing she's both the most public figure and the most private figure. And I'm always skeptical of people's claims about what she was like, because she was really good at hiding what she was like. Charles is not. I know Charles is a little bit more. It's a little bit more obvious what he thinks about certain things. Although, again, I'd be hesitant to claim any real understanding of what goes on in anyone's head, but in particular, the British royal family's head.
Well, and Charles, it seems, is in such a strange position. I mean, no one has ever been waiting in the wings for as long as he has. And then you combine that together with the mass media and the fact that very personal things about him have been exposed, leaked out. Sometimes political things, sometimes things about his opinions and how he tries to influence the architecture scene, and also very personal things about his affairs, which are not unusual. I mean, all kinds of people have extramarital affairs and all kinds of other personal dealings. Many rulers have had all kinds of skeletons in the closet about their personal lives. But Charles has been so exposed and so scrutinized in a way that no one has before, I would argue. It raises the question, can he keep this kind of magic going? And in some ways, your book made me think several different ways about it, because on the one hand, you emphasize how effective it was that people, starting in the 40s, starting with George the Sixth and then Elizabeth, were brought right up into the palace and just made such an impression on people. And they were so pleased having 20, 30 seconds to chat with the Queen. But sometimes, as you mentioned, sometimes also it was Charles as Prince of Wales. And a lot of people were very pleased and impressed with that too. He seems to have done that job effectively as well. So it just leaves me with the question, do you think that Charles as king can keep this sort of magic going?
So one of my favorite quotes anywhere, and that I quote anywhere in the book, is from Vera Lynn, the famous singer, and she did a lot of charity work herself, where she goes to receive, I can't remember which, she received many honors in her life, but one of the ones where she goes to the palace, she writes about it in an autobiography and says, well, the great thing about all the royals, but in particular about Prince Philip, is that he always knows the right thing to say to the right people. And that's like the reverse of Prince Philip's public reputation. Right? This is kind of like, when I read that, I was like, oh. but I think, I guess there are two things here. One is that I think in general, one of the things that certainly Elizabeth, Charles, Philip were careful to train and practice and foster was cold reading, being able to approach any person and talk to them about stuff and kind of make themselves charming. That is part of their job, and something that a lot of that's sort of it's central to the family business. It's a really, really important skill, because it means that in these little encounters, they leave a good impression. At the same time, I think, what's the right way of putting this, that a lot of this will come down to factors that are outside their control. There's very little in this process where the royal family actually has agency to change the bigger systems that determine their fate. They do have some that they can make good or bad choices. Elizabeth's choice that Charles needed to marry Diana was a terrible decision, and it hurt the royal family a lot. It was cruel. It was a bad decision. It hurt the people involved, and it hurt the institutions involved. So that does. But I think the decisions, the choices facing the royal family, there are a lot of potential bad decisions and not a lot of. It's really, really hard to see the future and see what the good right ways forward are. In particular, I think the Sussexes show this. Harry and Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, their alienation from the royal family shows the problems with making the royal family this kind of mirror onto which modern Britain projects itself. That when you've got vestiges, when you've got honours, it's the good things. It's like you're seeing, people everyone loves, or a lot of people love, or people who seem to be doing good things, going and getting received honours from the Queen, kneeling before the Queen. That looks really good. But the royal family is a reflection of modern Britain in other ways. And modern Britain is, the term I like to use is has this particular brand of passive aggressive racism that's pervasive and reaches throughout all its institutions. It turns out that the royal family was one of them. And I think, I don't know details about what went on there. There are many different stories here, but I'm sure that Meghan Markle was regularly suffered indignities at the hands of, if not the senior members of the royal family, then at least the whole system. This is a feature of modern Britain that the royal family reflects. That is not a great feature, and the more people see that in the controversies around the royal family, that's not going to go well for them, especially as with younger generations who are more diverse and are more interested in seeing the royal family, I think, as personalities than as kind of screens.
I mean, obviously, there's so much one could say and get into about the disaster with the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. But to me, like you said, there's a lot of details we don't know. But at the absolute bare minimum, something we do know is that this was the first time that a person of color of any sort was in the royal family, and there was going to necessarily be some racist reaction to that in Britain, abroad, both, and that they didn't protect her. They didn't. They didn't plan and mobilize to manage that problem. At the very
even though they failed to protect Diana as well. And I think this is something that they've been bad at doing for a long time, and they couldn't do it.
Yeah, and I have to say, I'm sure I'll get some blowback from admirers of the Queen, which, I think there's plenty of grounds to admire the Queen and plenty of grounds to criticize the Queen. But I do have to say, when the nation was in mourning, Charles made this very nice speech, a tribute to his mother. And he said a lot of very good, very nice things about her. But one of them that stuck out to me was, he said, she had an unfailing ability to see the best in people. And I think at least with the prominent example of Diana, she did fail to see the best.
Or she saw it, she failed to act. And I think this is kind of the, and it's the reverse. There's a really good recent book by Edward Owens about the royal family and kind of the interwar through the 50s, in which he points out that in the middle of the century, the royal family leaned more and more heavily into the language of duty and sacrifice. That kind of, and you see this everywhere in the responses to Elizabeth's death. The problem with this, I think, in this case in particular, is that if you make the royal, and that's highlighting they're also a family. That if you're sacrificing people for the duty, if you're chewing up the lives of the vulnerable women who enter the family as spouses driven by love and relationships, if then they're kind of chewed up by that duty and sacrifice, because ultimately their duty is to produce heirs and smile. Mm-hmm. And if their individuality is kind of shattered and crushed and pushed to the side, what does that say about the institution? That if it's an institution that's just about duty, sacrifice, and lots of money and privilege, that looks really bad.
Yeah.
Especially when other people are suffering. I do, like, Elizabeth seemed to be a very nice person, and she certainly was good at her job in a lot of ways, whatever her job was. And again, I think there's a lot of ambiguity about that. But someone really close to me in my family, my mother died a few years ago. It's in the book, so I can say this. I'm not gonna mourn a woman who I did not know, or watch a TV procession about her funeral, when someone I did care about, who I know to have been a good person, and I know this, there aren't many people about whom I can say that, but I know it was the case in 2019 when my mum died. I'm going to mourn her. I'm not going to mourn Elizabeth. Why should I? Anyway, that's a side note, but I think people. You see that for funerals as well. People are projecting the grief and the frustration with what's been happening in Britain in the last few years onto that funeral. Like all the jokes about how, she died after meeting Liz Truss, and as if kind of there was this, like, she's dying because modern Britain is dying. I think it's understandable, but it's like we should mourn the people who matter to us. And so, someone who mysteriously is the head of state of New Zealand, who I've never met, who enjoys an enormous amount of wealth, protection, privacy, and privilege that I can't even access. I'm not going to mourn that. She does seem to have been nice, but this is not. It just doesn't make sense to me. Sorry.
I think that adds a lot of dimension and brings out sort of what's at stake when so many people say of the Queen, she was like my gran. Right?
Yeah.
Almost as if they maybe, it's ambiguous. Maybe you're sort of saying you had this personal relationship to her, or in a sense you see her as you're substituting in this person you really knew and imagining that she is somehow a carbon copy of that when you don't really have a personal relationship with them, right? And a lot of people have drawn this connection, but I think your book reveals a whole other level to this sort of connection between monarchy and celebrity, right? And that people want to think that celebrities are people they really know, and they want to have a personal connection to.
Yeah. I didn't mean to write about monarchy in this book when I started it, but the just the logic of what people were saying about their honors pulled me into it.
Yeah, and that as I said, the Wilson government in the 60s, you explain, was sort of a watershed where Wilson used this language of magic. He was sort of drawing in the stardust of celebrities like the Beatles and bringing it into what seemed to be a stuffy, right? A very stuffy, hidebound institution. And there's this paradox that some people felt that the palace was selling out, right, by prostituting, cheapening these awards, giving them to sort of teeny bopper rockers who hadn't earned them. And then on the other hand, some Beatles fans felt that the Beatles were selling out, that they were sort of becoming
exactly
by going and
including John Lennon.
Yeah, and yet the irony is that to us today, it seems very natural, right? Think of Sir Paul McCartney and Dame Judi Dench. Of course, these British celebrities are going to get these honors. And it seems as if Sir Patrick Stewart, I mean, you could go on. And would you say it seems there's been a sort of merging now of the magic of celebrity with the magic of monarchy in the palace? And was the honor system part of this?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's right. And I think it's part of the generational. I think this is partly about how the press has changed and how in particular press coverage of the monarchy changed in the 50s and 60s. The monarchy was exposed to a new kind of scrutiny, and that scrutiny was a lot like celebrity scrutiny. The kind of rules changed, and there was a new kind of. Another thing about this is that a lot of the biggest innovators with honors in terms of prime ministers were those who were most cynical about it. Wilson, Lloyd George. I don't think John Major was cynical necessarily, but he was kind of an outsider to the system. So yeah, I think Wilson was ahead of his time in a number of ways with that focus on celebrity and with that intentional use of the immediate concerns of celebrity culture to try and modernize the honor system.
And it's remarkable too when you think about it there's been this evolution, like you described, where the state has nationalized certain industries, manufacturing, mining. And so then the honor system has had to extend to these important industries. And now, I mean, I'm sure I have a very American viewpoint on this, but I think of celebrity and entertainment as a major industry and export of Great Britain.
Yeah, no, that actually makes a lot of sense. I hadn't really been thinking about it like that, but I think this is all consistent with the Olympic opening ceremony a few years ago. This kind of packaging to the world of modern Britain is this combination of Elizabeth, James Bond, Winnie the Pooh. Paddington Bear was the more recent one. And then kind of in the physical setting of London as this kind of heritage city where you visit it to do any number of walking tours on whichever, whether it's the Beatles or Samuel Pepys that you're into. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I want to think about that a little bit more, because I think this goes back to what I was saying before about momentum in systems. I think this is true of the monarchy as much as the honor system. That I wrote a recent article about the problems Charles faces, and I think about it. I closed it by talking a little bit about how it's not clear what the purpose of monarchy is. That it's vague, it's open-ended, and how do you define success for a king or a queen? Is it about keeping old systems in place? Is it about survival, adaptation to new systems? Is it about reflecting society? Is it about changing society? I think all of those things kind of bounce around as concepts for the monarchy, but they're all really different, and there's a lot of tension between them. And this monarchy as celebrity thing is really interesting in that context, because it's definitely picking up something from society, but it probably also changes the tone of that discussion as well.
Yeah, and I think lastly, I shouldn't keep you too much longer, but
yeah.
I wanted to think about how this is all received abroad and how this affects sort of Britain's place and image in the world. And you mentioned this. For one thing, we've been talking about the Commonwealth, right? And how different Commonwealth nations opted out of the honors system at different times. And some of them also have opted out of the monarchy, right? Barbados just last year. And others have decided, well, we can be part of this Commonwealth organization, whatever that is, whatever that's about. But we want our own head of state. We don't want the monarch to still be this foreign kind of imperial head of state. And so it raises the question, is the transition to Charles going to accelerate that process? Is there anything that can be done? Is this just a generational shift where that sort of system of symbols and associations just won't work anymore, and there's really nothing the monarch can do? Or is there some way to reinvent it?
I think it's helpful here to think about what is it the monarchy does for these places. I think it's pretty clear what they give to the monarchy. The monarchy can kind of enjoys traveling around and getting associated with the wide range of diversity in the places where the monarchy, in these Commonwealth realms. There are roughly as many people in the Commonwealth realms as there are in Britain itself. I did this calculation when Elizabeth died, and I think you have to kind of differentiate between the former settler colonies, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and then the other Commonwealth realms in the Caribbean, Papua New Guinea.
Solomon Islands, I think.
Solomon Islands. And I think it's looking pretty fragile in Jamaica, for one thing. I think I don't want to predict the future, but it seems likely that this is going to be an important discussion in Jamaica. The former settler colonies are a lot more complicated in a lot of ways. Well, not more complicated, but more. It's a lot more difficult to see where that discussion is going to go in a couple of ways. For two reasons I want to mention. One is that I think constitutionally, having the monarch as head of state and having a governor general as representative of that monarch gives governments a lot of flexibility. Governors general have exercised power in the last 50 years in ways that the Queen would never have been allowed to. Governors general actually have a pretty important constitutional role in certain key events around governments in Canada in the last 10 years, Australia in the 1970s. So they also delay having to have awkward conversations about what the country should be. If you don't have the Queen as the sovereign of New Zealand, then the Queen has to kind of negotiate with the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister has to kind of negotiate with the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister has to kind of negotiate with the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister has to kind of negotiate with the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister has to kind of negotiate with the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister has to kind of negotiate with the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister has to kind of negotiate with the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister has to kind of negotiate with the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister has to kind of negotiate with the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister has to kind of negotiate with the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister has to kind of negotiate with the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister has to kind of negotiate with the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister has to kind of negotiate with the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister has to kind of negotiate with the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister has to kind what is New Zealand's constitution? You'd have to go through. I'm very interested in this because I quite like this to happen. I think it would be a really interesting conversation, but it'll be a really difficult one. And I think that having the king now as sovereign in some of these places seems to them to be worth it to delay or to not have to have awkward conversations about what the constitution should be of an independent Canada or of an independent New Zealand. Yeah. Australia, I'm not so sure. The other thing, though, is that, and this is true, especially in Canada and New Zealand, not so much in Australia, that there are a lot of divisions in Indigenous populations about whether or not it's desirable to become republics. That the Crown creates this constitutional stretchiness where the treaties that Maori signed in 1840 and that various Native North American groups signed with the various kind of precursors of the Canadian government in the 19th century, those treaties were signed with the British monarch, which creates a way of an alternate conversation to simply between those groups and the settler governments. So there's a lot of complexity in those situations because I think that there's a way in which monarchy does offer something to different parties involved in what are very much domestic debates or specific local debates in these places. The monarchy offers a tool for thinking through those debates, even if it doesn't really know it or play an active role in it.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point and also can be kind of ironic, right? It's a way of going over the heads of the really, colonial, would have been colonial regime in those countries. And I thought another really interesting story in your book was I think military nurses in New Zealand who have Maori heritage.
Oh yeah. It's a picture. Yeah.
Yeah, and one of them posed for her official sort of portrait when receiving her honors in traditional Maori dress.
Yeah.
And it seems to raise so many possibilities of what she was thinking. And did she see this again as kind of an honor for the Maori population or for her clan that she ought to accept in this formal way? But a last point I wanted to throw up and just see if you had any thoughts about was, did your study of this system make you look at all differently about status and sort of meritocracy in quotation marks?
Right.
In general, in American society or at large. And, and it crossed my mind as I was reading this that technically you and I both do have post-nominal letters, and that's PhD, right? And it made, and it's something I know that I've thought about, you can see possible parallels of how institutions kind of dispense status through these formalized mechanisms, but they're not the same, right? They're not the same as in Britain. And did you think about those comparisons or contrasts?
I certainly thought about the arbitrariness of a lot of this, a lot in grad school and since then. I think, I think if anything, this highlighted to me, and this is not a very historical claim, but ruthlessness of large-scale decision-making about hierarchies, and maybe in contrast to that, the importance of local communities, that the most authentic is a tough word to use, but it highlights the way in which I think in large modern societies organized around national or sort of large-scale political principles, so much of the kind of sorting and hierarchies of those principles is so arbitrary and so cold. And I think I've been thinking a lot myself about who am I? What does it mean to be an individual and a person in a society, in a community, in a society? And in the past, I've hung a lot on post-nominal letters or like status positions and stuff like that. And I think this shows how hollow that is. That this is an interesting system. It's an important system. It often was really important to individuals, but it's still hollow. It's still at its core. There's nothing there about what's really, really important in your relationships with other people. And that I think I thought about that a lot when I was writing this.
And, for me growing up in the United States and living in the US my whole life, it seems like this whole idea of meritocracy has really grown and advanced, but without examination of, well, who gets to measure merit, right? And
Yeah,
is it
yeah,
something that's dropped down on you from above, or is it
yeah,
something that your peers around you
yeah,
give to you? Who's elevating you, right? Is it your
yeah,
peers,
yeah,
or is it
exactly.
someone above you in some sort of putative hierarchy? And so to me it struck me that this is very much about Britain, but it's also, again, it's about
Yeah.
status and the sort of contradictions and the hidden mechanisms of status, the hidden logics of status.
I think that that is exactly right. And I always struggled to convey that, but I'm glad you got that from this, because I think that that is something that really haunted me throughout this book.
Yeah. So it's a really beautiful book, From Servants of the Empire to Everyday Heroes, by Tobias, or Toby Harper,
Oh
as
yeah,
I've
yeah.
also as I've also known him, who's a professor of history at Arizona State University. So thank you so much for talking with me.
Well, thank you, Sam. This was really great.
Beautiful.